realize that AI means different things in different parts of the country. Artificial intelligence. Okay, so the question for today is, we're going to talk about artificial intelligence. So the question is, let's start with, what is AI? The idea is, what's AI? We're going to do this interactively. I hate to actually have discussion. Do a presentation. What's AI? Yes, sir?
Computer program will take input, process it, and out.
Okay, so it's a computer program that's intelligent, right? So AI is about intelligent computer programs. And the motivation, of course, is the more intelligent your programs are, the more useful you're likely to be. Okay, so what are some examples of AI applications? I mean, there's kind of two sides of this. The first side is sort of engineering, right? What we want to be able to do is want to be able to build smart computer programs. Again, because smarter programs are likely to be more useful. So what are some examples of AI program systems, etc.? Google? Maybe. I mean, parts of it, but most of it, I mean, that's really sort of a large data processing. But we'll take that. Other examples? These seem more intelligent. Yes, sir? Siri. Siri I like better. Siri's a great example. Right? Personal digital assistant. You can talk to her. She can tell you stuff. Recently, actually, the person whose voice it was actually unmasked. Professional voice actor. Yeah. Watson. Watson, the Jeopardy. How many people saw the Jeopardy match between Watson and the people? A lot, right? Pretty cool, huh? I mean, Watson's kind of neat. The thing I didn't like about Watson is it's one of those games where it's not really fair to have competition between human and machine because little details are not so relevant, like the response time of the computer relative to human make a huge difference, right? So the buzzer is a big thing in Jeopardy. Right, so that made it a little bit less fair to the humans. The other thing, which wasn't as obvious if you think about it, is that if you think about Jeopardy, right, the computer's going to be good at certain kinds of questions. Humans are going to be good at other kinds of questions. The fact there were 3 entities playing, 2 of them were humans, meant Jennings and the other guy tended to split the human questions, and Watson was by itself on the computer questions. So it got an advantage that way. You going to try it again? All right, you can take it away. Okay, cool. Other examples: AI systems. Come on, folks. Participation. I'm sorry? Wolfram. Okay. Wolfram Alpha. Alpha. Okay. Other applications. Yes, sir.
Video games.
Video games. Well, in what way are video? Let's be a little more specific. In what way are video games AI?
Because they react to what you do.
Right. So you to the extent that you play against an agent in a video game, right? So the other agents that are not you are certainly great examples of AI systems. So this is video game opponents. I still find this amazing because I'm just not a fan of that stuff, but I know most of you are. That the video game industry is bigger than the motion picture industry. Unbelievable. It's been that way for a long time. For example, yes, sir. Skynet. So the first time I gave this lecture, someone said Skynet, and I said, "What's that?" And I now know that it's a movie, but I still haven't seen it, so I'm going to put it up there because it sounds good. But I don't know anything about it because I haven't seen the movie. Yeah. I'm sorry. Deep Blue. Deep Blue is a good one. How many people remember Deep Blue? You guys are too young. So this is one that's near and dear to my heart because it's so classic, right? One of the very first applications of AI, even before the term artificial intelligence was coined, and this was done in the 1950s, right? So this is around, some of this before some of your parents were born, was playing a game like chess, and it was one of the classic applications. And the first papers written about this were written by people like Alan Turing, Claude Shannon, names you may or may not recognize, but really giants in the field of computers and information processing. And the challenge was to build a program that could defeat the human world champion at chess. And it was done, of course, in 1997 by Deep Blue, which is an IBM machine, not unlike, it was sort of a precursor to Watson in terms of IBM's involvement in this business. So what was interesting about the chess problem, I mean, I like chess better than Jeopardy as a domain for computers versus people, because there's really no advantage to the humans or the machines in chess, right? There's really, if you look at the domain, the rules don't really favor one or another. And right now, the best programs are better than the best people. Reminds me of a story. This is a colleague of mine wrote the world's best checkers program, and he had this. He was playing for, so checkers is a little bit different than chess, but a similar sort of thing. And the human world champion in checkers was defeated before Kasparov was defeated by Deep Blue. But before this happened, his program was playing in a tournament in Tupelo, Mississippi. Chess is sort of more lowbrow. My apologies to those of you from Mississippi. It was a tournament, and he was playing some guy named King, and the other people in the tournament said, "Keep an eye on King." He said, "Why?" Just keep an eye on him. So anyway, the program's sitting there playing, and this guy who wrote the program is operating the program, and the human King is sitting there drumming his fingers on the table. Which normally would be considered a little rude in a human match, but the computer doesn't care. So at some point, what the human opponent does when it thinks, I guess, the computer's not looking, is it sort of flicks one of the computer's pieces off the board and onto the floor. So this is hilarious. No one else finds this hilarious? So I find this hilarious. Applause, right? Or laugh. So this is hilarious on several levels, right? At the first level, right, this is like the national championships, right? In the national championship, someone would cheat, and in such a primitive way, right? I mean, this is the way my brother used to cheat with me in board games when I was 4 and he was 6. He'd like steal my money when I wasn't looking, right? So the fact that would happen. But the other interesting part, which is funnier to the rest of us, is this guy's model of the computer that makes him think that this is going to help. That somehow, if that piece is not on the board, the computer's going to forget about it, right? And so, what this colleague of mine did was exactly the right thing, which was he picked up the piece, he put it back on the board, didn't say another word, and the game went on that way. Other applications. Some applications of AI. There's some really good ones out there. Yeah. I love this one. Self-driving cars. Let's talk about this a little bit. This is one of my favorite because my personal opinion. First of all, it's in the future. We don't quite have it ready for prime time, even though Google's been driving around for several years all over California in a self-driving car. Just so you don't get too worried, there's a licensed driver behind the wheel at all times, and the licensed driver is in charge of the car. And only about once every 1,000 miles or so does the driver actually have to do something. Okay, so why would you want self-driving cars? What are some of the reasons? Let's talk about some of the motivations for self-driving cars. Why would you want such a thing? Yeah. I'm sorry? You don't have to pay a driver, right? So cabs would be a lot cheaper. Cheaper cabs. What else? Some other motivations. There's a bunch of them. Yeah.
For disabled people.
Disabled folks, right? Someone to drive. Other reasons. Yeah. Reduce accidents. Here's a question. How many people here are between the ages of 15 and 24? Everyone except Terry. Okay. What's the leading cause of death among people 15 to 24? In fact, the entire world, not just the U.S. Traffic accidents by far. Traffic accidents, the biggest cause. How many people die in the U.S. in traffic accidents every year? Ballpark. About 30K. About 30,000 deaths in the U.S. every year. Right? What's the cause of most traffic accidents? Under the influence is a big part of it, right? More generally, what's the cause of most traffic accidents? It's human error of one sort. I mean, it's very rare that there's a traffic fatality, right, that doesn't involve human error. And that includes driving under the influence or anything else. And a lot of it, frankly, is disabled driving. Is not disabled driving, distracted driving. Disabled driving. So this is a huge problem. And it's very likely that automated cars would be safer, okay, than humans, right? They're not going to be texting while they're driving, hopefully. And so this is a huge motivation. Other motivations. Why else would you want self-driving cars? Yeah.
Cut down air pollution.
Okay. Air pollution. Why would self-driving cars cut down air
I
pollution?
know like original idea of Google is to cut down, so like people can schedule self-driving car and treat it as a public transportation instead of driving to work.
Okay, so you could, well, but if you still got one person in the car, it doesn't matter, right? There's actually, I mean, this turns out to be important, but the reason is not completely obvious why this reduces pollution. Yeah.
Because it can drive more efficiently than we can.
Could drive more efficiently. Let's go with that. How else? Let's be even clearer. Go ahead. Yeah.
If you have a bunch of self-driving cars, they can optimize traffic.
They can optimize traffic. Okay. Yeah.
Also, if they know the speed limits, they don't like to accelerate like fast. Like they want to drive like steadily.
Right. They'll drive at the speed limits. Okay. All those are true. What else can self-driving cars do? Maybe not so obvious. Self-driving cars can actually drive closer together to each other, right? There's this concept called platooning, right, where you put cars very close to one another. Humans can't do it because we can't react fast enough, right? You've got a big long chain of cars and one is right behind another communicating, possibly, okay, electronically, right? Then basically only the car in front is really burning any gas. The rest are basically drafting all the rest. So you can actually, for the same, even if you have one person in the car, you can actually get away with a lot less burning a lot less fossil fuels because you can line these cars up in a platoon. The one in front is doing all the work, and the ones behind are simply coasting along, drafting. Their engines are running a little bit, but they do very, very little work if they're close together. Computer cars can do that. Human-driven cars cannot. Okay. Other motivations for self-driving cars. How many people think we're going to have self-driving cars? Let's say in the next 10 years. How many people think in the next 10 years there'll be self-driving cars on the roads? Pessimistic. I've got a bet going with my stepson in 10 years that we're going to have self-driving cars on the roads. I hope it happens. Any other motivations people can think of? There's lots of other costs of cars. So there's air pollution. There's traffic fatalities. What are some of the other costs of cars we may not appreciate? Yeah.
Multitasking.
I'm sorry.
Multitasking.
Multitasking.
In the sense that you might be able to.
Oh, so yeah, you don't have to drive, right? So you don't have to drive. Saves time, right? Other ideas? Yeah.
Like a minor, or like someone who can't drive yet to get themselves places they need to go.
Minors can drive without fake IDs. Get places, not drive. So here's another one. Here's a question. How many parking spaces do you think there are in the United States for every car? Approximately. What's the ratio of cars to parking spaces? How many parking spaces for every car? Guesses? Ideas?
1.5 to 1.
1.5 to 1. That's certainly there's at least one, right? Because every car's got to do something almost all the time, and most of them are not on the road, believe it or not. It's actually higher than 1.5 to 1. Parking space, the entire country, any parking space. Yeah, everything, parking space. It's about 3 to 1. So for every car, there's 3 parking spaces, right? It's never occupying more than one at a time. That's a huge cost of real estate, right? People would need, right? So another issue is what about you go out to dinner, right? You drink even responsibly, right? You're not drunk, okay? But you've had a little bit of alcohol in your system, right? You may still be illegal to drive, right? If you have a self-driving car, then you don't need a designated driver, right? There's no reason for anyone to be driving even moderately under the influence of any way, shape, or form. Okay? You may not even, if you had self-driving cars, you may not even own a car, right? Maybe what you do is when you want a car, you just push a button on your phone and the car comes to you. Essentially, it's a cab. But cab now is a lot cheaper, right? Because you don't have to pay a driver, right? Obviously, the biggest cost of a cab is the driver itself, it's not the car. So maybe you don't even bother owning cars. Other comments? Anything else on self-driving cars? Any other applications people want to suggest? It's on my list that we forgot. How about navigation systems? cool directions, right? That turns out it's an AI application. It's actually a relatively straightforward one. Oh, those are the good ones. We got the good ones. Okay, other comments on these or other applications? Okay, so all of these are basically, I mean, this is basically engineering, right? These are applications to try to build smarter systems that would be useful to us, right? There's another side of AI, put on the board, which is sort of a scientific problem. And the fundamental scientific problem of AI is, what is the nature of intelligence? Let's put this in context, okay, with things that you're more familiar with. These things that sounds a little abstract. Let's think about physics, right? So let's think of a different example. So what's physics about? What's physics about? Anyone here take physics? Right? What's physics about? Okay, and what about reality? What is physics fundamentally concerned with?
Interaction between two or more
Two or more objects,
objects.
more generally. What's physics about?
The study of energy and matter.
It's the nature of matter and energy. Physics is about the fundamental, the nature, it's not E, it's a C, right? The nature of matter, energy. And it's an entire, it's a huge scientific problem. It's been around for a very, very long time. Fundamentally, trying to understand what is stuff, right? What is matter, and what is energy. Let's look at another example. Biology. What's biology about?
Life.
It's the nature of life, nature of living things. Now, in some sense, these are all pretty fundamental basic things, right? Matter and energy, living things, right? Intelligence is also a pretty fundamental thing that we see in the world, right? It's created, we see it in humans, we see it in animals, we see it in machines to some extent. It would be interesting to understand fundamentally what those things were about. Okay? Now let's think about biology. We talk about the nature of life. In particular, what is a biology? In what terms is a biologist trying to explain life? Right. So if you're a biologist, right, you're interested in the nature of life. You know, it's not a theological question. You're not concerned about morality, that sort of thing. What are you fundamentally trying to do in terms? What does it mean to understand some living phenomenon, living organism to a biologist? What is a biologist trying to do? Yeah.
How it behaves in its natural habitat.
How it behaves, right? So that's sort of the observation of it, right? But if you're trying to explain how it actually does something, what sort of explanations are offered by biologists to sort of explain living phenomena? What sort of language do they use to explain what's going on in the living organism? Yeah.
Mostly in terms of chemistry.
Mostly in terms of chemistry, right? So what biology is about reducing living phenomena to chemistry. It's often called biochemistry, right? But it's a reductionist program, right? So the question is, how to explain living phenomena in terms of chemistry. That's what biologists do. In fact, about 150 years ago, there used to be a raging debate in biology about whether living organisms were just sort of complex biochemical mechanisms or there's something fundamentally different. Right? There were two schools of thought. One was called the mechanists. So the mechanists versus the vitalists. And the mechanists believed that any living organism, including a human, was really nothing more than a very complex biochemical engine of sorts, right? Some sort of complex biochemical machine, and everything, all of living phenomena can be explained in terms of biochemistry, right? The vitalists did not believe this. The vitalists said, no, there's fundamentally a difference between something that's alive and something that's not. There's this sort of, they had difficulty putting their finger on it, but there was this sort of extra sort of spark of life which distinguished a living thing from a non-living thing. Okay, now I said this debate used to rage about 150 years ago. Is this still a current debate in biology? Is this still a big debating point in biology anymore? No. Who won? Mechanists won, right? Basically all working biologists believe at this point that there isn't anything really fundamentally different about a living thing, right? It's just complicated biochemical mechanism. Okay, so there's a reason we're going through this. And in fact, lots of subjects are reductionist subjects. In fact, chemistry is really sort of also kind of about matter and energy, mostly about matter. And chemistry is usually, a chemist is trying to reduce chemical phenomena or chemical reactions to what? How does the chemist want to explain what's going on? In physics, right? So the chemists want to reduce everything down to physics, right? The physicists want to reduce things down to what? Generally, what tool do they use? Mathematics, right? So this is sort of, reduction to mathematics. Right? So the biologists want to reduce stuff to chemistry. Chemistry wants to reduce things, reduction to physics. Now, let's think about the nature of intelligence, right? Is there a reductionist paradigm going on in intelligence? So if you're an AI scientist and you want to understand the nature of intelligence, what is it you're trying to, what sort of language do you use? What are you trying to explain intelligent behavior in terms of? You're trying to use some underlying mechanism to sort of explain intelligent behavior. What is that underlying? What's the reductionist paradigm associated with AI? Understand the nature of intelligence. What do we want to explain intelligence? What are our models for explaining intelligence? Yeah.
Yeah,
Computer programming, okay? More generally, information processing, right? So, the scientific problem of AI, right? So, AI tries to reduce intelligent behavior to information processing. And that's why computers are important, right? So there's kind of two sides to this, okay? There's sort of a, and the research paradigm here is what you do is you take some intelligent behavior and you try to mimic that behavior using typically an information processing model. What's the most common information processing model we use? Computer program, right? So basically the nature, if you want to study any particular intelligent behavior, take any of our list here, right? Like playing chess, what you do is you try to build an information processing model. The form that information processing model usually takes is in the form of a computer program, right? So the challenge is, if you're studying chess and you're an AI scientist, is can I build a computer program that plays chess? Take any one of those applications. Or if you're interested in a personal digital assistant like Siri, can I build a computer program which will produce that sort of behavior? And it's a separate question from whether it's useful or not. The question is, can it be done at all? Okay, so this is the information processing school of AI, or also cognitive science. Now, there's kind of, any questions about this before I go on? Comments? It's getting less interactive. I don't know if it's me or you. Probably me. All right, so if we think about this, there's kind of two different ways, two sort of related fields here. There's one called sort of the pure AI problem, and there's also a field called cognitive psychology. So let's look at cognitive psychology for a second. What's cognitive psychology about? Fundamentally, what's cognitive psychology about? Study of how we think, right? So it's the study of human information processing. So cognitive psychology is really studying, let's say, of human intelligence. So what we're interested here in cognitive psychology is how is it that humans solve particular tasks that require intelligent behavior. Okay. Now notice this is very different than necessarily understanding how it can be done in general. They're not necessarily the same thing. So if we take an example such as chess, and we're going to distinguish this from the purely AI point of view, right? So the AI point of view is what's the AI point of view in contrast here? I mean, human information processing is interesting, but generally what are we interested in terms of AI, in terms of intelligent behavior? How do we produce intelligent behavior in computers or machine, right? So how can a machine produce intelligent behavior? Now let's take a common domain, right? Computers play chess and humans play chess, right? They both do the same thing. Do they do it the same way? Do humans and computers play chess the same way? No. Who said no? Why? Why or why not? Yes, sir.
So people are, they're processing. I guess the computer's running on an algorithm that analyzed.
The computer's running on an algorithm. That's certainly the case.
Based on, I guess, some sort of machine learning where they have been exposed to like thousands of other games, so they have like an accumulation of knowledge, and they're just basing.
You're talking about the computer? Or the computer. The computer, okay.
And they're basing their moves off of like thousands of other games, and there's like some predetermined probability or something.
And that's different than a human how?
And a human being, I guess, well, they can't. I guess it's different in the capacity of how much information you can hold.
Well, so it turns out that when Deep Blue played Kasparov, Deep Blue hadn't played previous chess games, right? It played some in development, but had not been exposed to thousands and thousands of games. In fact, Kasparov has certainly seen a lot more games than Deep Blue. So, I mean, you're close, but not quite. Yeah.
Tested moves in advance and graded the positions that use
Okay. So Deep Blue tested moves in advance. So what Deep Blue did in some sense is it searched the space of possible moves. It's sort of like when you start to learn, right? You sit there, you take a piece, and you move it, right? You say, okay, look, you keep your finger on it, you take your finger off, and you make the move, right? You say, let's see, what will happen if I do that, right? In fact, what Deep Blue would do is for every possible move, would say, what would happen if I make this move without taking its finger off, figuratively, of course. Then it would say, well, if I make that move, then what's my opponent going to do? My opponent could do this. And then if my opponent does that, what could I do, right? So this is called a search, right? What Deep Blue does is it looks at sequences of various kinds of moves, okay? In fact, does anyone have any idea how many sort of moves that Deep Blue evaluated or looked at before it actually made an individual move? In the course of making a move, how many positions did it examine, per minute or second, or any ideas? Guesses?
Millions?
I'm sorry?
Millions?
Billions, yeah, pretty close. So Deep Blue could look at about something like 200 million positions per second. Okay, so Deep Blue could examine something like 200 million positions per second. Now, Kasparov couldn't do that, right? Kasparov could probably, maybe 10. Let's be generous. It probably can't even do 10. Maybe between 1 and 10. So there's an enormous mismatch between what the computer's doing, right, and what the humans do. In fact, the surprising thing to me, and probably most people in this field, was not that a computer could beat a human at chess. What's surprising, and still surprising to me, is that a human can compete with a computer at chess, right? Here's this machine that can look at 200 million positions in the course of a second. Easily can look at over 1 billion positions in the course of a move, where it can take, a minute or two, right? But it's still competitive. The humans are still almost competitive. So what we find is a situation where they behave very differently. Okay? We actually know, from the AI point of view, we understand chess very well from the AI point of view because we built the darn programs, right? We wrote the programs, we debugged them, we can know just about anything we want to know about how Deep Blue or any other program plays chess. Okay? What do we know about how a human plays chess compared to that?
So basically it's the same, except it's more intelligent search. So you're not looking at all the moves that you know are going to be bad. You don't even check those moves. You just do the ones that are viable in your mind.
So I would agree with most of what you said, except for the first thing you said, which is basically the same, right? I mean, in some sense, a human does a little bit of search, but a minuscule amount. So it's really very, very different. A human does almost no search. In fact, we really know very little about. So Kasparov will look at a few moves, maybe, right? But how Kasparov is able to rule out all the moves that are no good so quickly, we have no idea. And neither is he either, right? Someone asked him, once, how deep do you look? He says, well, sometimes. There's actually a very famous game. Before Kasparov was champion, there was a guy named American named Bobby Fischer. A few years before that, who was a human world champion. And Fischer did something amazing in the game. He was playing a grandmaster, and he sacrificed his queen, right? So he made a move which was clearly going to sacrifice his queen, okay? And his human opponent stared at this for a long time. Fischer was not just some kid. Fischer was a very, very accomplished chess player. So his opponent said, this is not just a stupid blunder. There's something up this guy's sleeve. But for the life of him, he couldn't figure out what the trap was, what the trick was, right? So he finally just captured the queen, and then lost the game 19 moves later. So Fischer had seen a mate combination 19 moves in advance. Now, the combinatorics tells us that he certainly wasn't able in any way, shape, or form to really look 19 moves ahead, right? You ask them, if you ask Kasparov, how does he know which moves to look at? He says he looks at the right moves, right? But we really have no idea how a human plays chess. It's really kind of a mystery, right? With pretty limited hardware. Clearly, humans know a lot more about chess. They have a lot more knowledge than the machine. The machine has very, very limited knowledge in some sense. But the difference in the speed is enormous. So the point here is that you can have two different entities, if you will. I won't really call a person machine, even though I think of people as machines in that regard. You have two different things that play chess. They may play them very, very differently, but still produce the same behavior. They both play pretty well, right? The best programs are a little bit better than the best people right now, but the best people are quite comparable. It's not a complete total mismatch. Questions? Comments? So, point here is that, you build a machine to do something, right? In some sense, you're limited by the task itself, right? If a computer program plays chess, it's got to play legal chess. It's got to play according to the rules of chess. There's a whole bunch of constraints are imposed by that. But the hardware, the fundamental hardware, is very different, so there's no reason to expect a program to play the same way as a human. In fact, there's other examples we can see of the same thing. So let's take another analogy, right? Instead of chess machines, let's think about flying machines. I'll put machines in quotes here. So what are two examples of flying machines? Two very, very different examples of flying machines that exist in the world. Yeah.
Airplanes and helicopters?
Yeah, there's airplanes. So let's take airplanes. Maybe I biased it a little bit by calling them machines. What else do we have in the world? Birds, right? Let's take airplanes versus birds. Helicopters are interesting too, but that's a different thing. So both of these things fly, right? They're both subject to the same laws of physics and aerodynamics, right? They both got to fly through the air. They're both heavier than air, and they both fly. But they fly in very, very different ways, right? Birds flap their wings. Apparently, you get on a plane that doesn't flap its wings. They have very different characteristics, right? So, airplanes burn massive amounts of jet fuel. Birds eat a few worms. That seems to be enough. Which are better? What are the better flying machines? What's better, airplanes or birds? Which of these two things is better at flying? Good question. What do I mean by better? Which is faster? Airplanes are faster. Which can carry more cargo? Which is more maneuverable? Birds. Which can land and take off in much shorter spaces? Birds, right? So it really depends on, it's a very good question, it really depends on what you want, right? In some sense, airplanes are much faster, they can carry a lot more cargo, Okay, but birds, you know, if you ever watch a hummingbird fly, it's just a really beautiful experience, right? They're much more facile, they're much more agile, they're much more delicate. They can do much fancier things than airplanes. So the point is, again, we have an example where the same sort of behavior we find in nature and we find in machines, and they do in some ways the same thing, but they do them in very different ways. Question, comment? Let's take another thing. How about locomotion on land? What's the predominant paradigm for locomotion on land for machines that humans build? What do we basically do for locomotion on land? Wheels. Wheel and axle, right? So for machines, we use the wheel and axle. What does nature use for locomotion? There's a lot of differences, but what's a common one, at least in higher?
Legs.
Legs, right? Nature or people tend to use legged locomotion. Now, why might that be? Why does one use? Why do machines use wheel and axle? Why don't and nature uses legs? And why don't and vice versa? Why doesn't it work the other way around? They're both trying to solve the same problem. They like to be able to move in the world. Yeah.
Well, wheels are easier to build, but before we had machine wheels, we had to build roads, which nature doesn't always have nice flat things to wheel across.
So one very important thing here is legged locomotion is much more general, right? You know, in order for wheel locomotion, you really need pretty good roads in order for that to work, right? But if you really want very general locomotion, you really want legged locomotion. This is much more general. Other reasons why it works this way. Yeah.
Wheels need some separate thing that can rotate. Like motors, you can't make the wheels.
It's unlikely that you know we don't have wheels and axles in nature, because if you think about it, the wheel is actually separate from the axle, right? And it couldn't really be part of the same organism, because there wouldn't be any way to transfer blood and everything else between the two, because the wheel rotates around the axle. Okay, so it's something that's really not accessible to nature to create a single organism that has both a wheel and axle. Okay, so what we find here is that, you know, which is more powerful, by the way, which is faster, et cetera, et cetera. The wheel and axle generally is probably more powerful, right? In fact, this distinction here between power and generality is not uncommon, right? When often what we have is when we construct machines to do things, okay, we often construct machines to do very particular things, right? And the economics, you know, we're building machines to be sold for people to use. The economics are often such that we make very particular machines to do very particular things. So the kind of locomotion that a car does is specialized to a road, specialized to high speed. It doesn't work so well. You know, a car's not very good at climbing trees or doing other sorts of things. But people are. People are much more general. I'll give you another example of specialization versus generality. So in our home we have two washing machines. Okay? One of them we call the dishwasher, and the other we call the clothes washer. Right? So this is just, they're both washing machines, right? But they're very specialized. Right? It doesn't work very well to put the clothes in the dishwasher. They don't come out. It works even worse. Put the dishes in the clothes washer. They're very specialized machines to do very particular tasks. What nature tends to do, okay, nature tends to build more general machines. Because of evolution, a general machine is more likely to be successful because it can operate in various kinds of machines. Okay? Questions? Okay, so what we haven't talked about yet is what do we mean by intelligence? Okay? Now, the first thing I would say is, you know, we're not going to spend a lot of time here. Of course, we don't have a lot of time. But we're not going to worry too much about a formal definition of intelligence. In the same way that biologists don't worry a lot about sort of formal definitions of life, right? It's not as, you know, it's sort of a philosophical issue. You know, what's living, what's not living? Is a virus alive? Is it not alive? You know, it's a generally interesting question, but it's not the burning question that biologists spend all their time on. They sort of say, well, we know living things, we see it, and we're not going to spend all of our effort trying to define what is alive and what is not. By the same token, AI folks don't spend a lot of time worrying about what is intelligent and what is not. It's important, but it's not the most critical thing. So I'm going to argue here that there's kind of three components to intelligence, three fundamental components. Okay? And the first is what I'll call sensing. The second we'll call thinking. And then the last we'll call acting. And basically the way these work is they kind of, an intelligent organism kind of goes in this cycle. It senses the world around it. It thinks about what it's sensing, okay, and then it tries to take an action to achieve some particular goal. And then it goes back and senses the world to see is it closer to its goal than it was before. Does some more thinking and then some more acting. Okay, so let's start with the sensing issue. What are the senses that are probably most important to us and also most important to machines as well? What are the senses that are probably most important to us? Yeah. Sight. What else? What's second probably? Sensing. Well, there's haptic sensing, right? There's feeling. So there's height. There's sight. There's haptic sensing, which is touch. What else? Words. What's the sense though? Hearing, right? So probably the most important ones here are things like seeing, hearing, and possibly tactile. So seeing, important problem, right? What's the computer analog of seeing is what? How does a computer see? What does it use as its organ first? It uses a camera, right? So it takes a camera image and tries to produce, it takes the input from a camera. So the computer version of this takes the input from a camera. Okay, computer version of hearing, the input comes from a microphone, right? So it's a camera. It's a microphone. We'll leave tactile out because it's a little more complicated. So let's think about the microphone. So this is what Siri could do, right? Speech understanding, right? It takes as an input a waveform, okay, which is just an amplitude signal of sound pressure, okay, and tries to figure out what words are being said. It's a speech understanding problem. Difficult problem, right? People have worked on it for a very long time. We're getting reasonably good at it, okay? There are practical applications. One of the nice things about this lecture is it gets easier to give every year because there's more and more applications that are out there, right? So we have machines that can do a pretty good job of hearing spoken English, at least figuring out what the words are, right? If you ask Siri a very complicated question, right? She's not likely to know the answer. It's not because she doesn't understand the words, she doesn't know the words, she just can't make sense of what the question might be. But so speech understanding to some extent is a close to solved problem. Vision is not, right? So the camera input is a really hard problem because what a camera sees, high quality camera, what it gets, if I think of what's impinging on my retinas is maybe about 1 million picture elements, right, or pixels, right? Let's say 1,000 by 1,000, okay? Each one of those picture elements consists of 3 numbers, red, green, and blue, for example, in full color, right? But it's just a matrix of, 3 million numbers now, right? And so the computer problem is you take that matrix of 3 million numbers and can you figure out what it is you're actually seeing? Can I recognize, for example, that I'm in a classroom? Okay? That there's a table here. That's important, right? Because if I go forward, I'm going to run into it, right? I can recognize individual people. Some of you I recognize, most I don't. Okay? So it's a very, very complex problem, and it's still a huge research problem. Another issue here with sensing is that context turns out to be very important. So there's a classical example of this is a problem in sort of optical character recognition. If I do this right, we can write the words. Anyone read those 2 words? What's it say? The cat, right? Everyone looks at it and says, yeah, the cat. It's pretty easy. Now, what I tried to do, as some of you will notice, is actually to draw these 2 letters as close as I can, right? If I did this with a machine, I can make sure it's identical, right? Just copy the same thing. And yet you have no trouble recognizing this. Now think about what must be going on that you can read those words, right? What's going on is, if you have a very simple model which says, first of all, you recognize individual characters, and then you put them together into words, that doesn't quite work for this example, right? Because whatever you decide this is going to be, if you decide it's going to be an H, then you get this nonsensical word CHT. If you decide this is an A, then you get this nonsensical word TAE, right? But what you do is you look at it, right, and you interpret it within the context of what you're seeing, okay? And all of a sudden you realize, in this context, this must be an H, okay, and this must be an A. Okay? In fact, if you look at it quickly, right, you probably didn't even notice immediately that those are actually identical or very close to identical. Right? So context turns out to be very important. Speech is the same way. When you hear someone say something, it's often ambiguous, right? And you can only resolve the ambiguity by understanding the context. If this is what the person said, it makes sense in that context. If it's something else, it says something different in a different context. So sensing turns out to be a difficult problem. To some extent, we can sort of resolve this. Thinking is what we originally started worrying about, right? So thinking is stuff like, playing chess, okay, doing calculus problems, right? All the stuff that college students do. And in fact, this part, of these three components, the easiest one probably is thinking. Okay? Because, and it's a little bit paradoxical, right? Take a newborn baby, right? What do they learn first, right? Well, they learn sensing, and then it takes a little bit while longer. They learn acting, learn how to walk and such, right? The thinking is a lot longer coming, right? However, for machines, it's sort of the opposite, right? It turns out that this is the pretty easy thing, right? For machines, these are the hard things. Now, it's not surprising to think about. This sort of abstract thinking is not something that has a very long and distinguished evolutionary history. It's something we've been doing relatively recently, right? And so it's not surprising. People suggest that maybe half of our cerebral cortex is devoted to vision, because vision is very important, particularly for lower animals. If you want to be able to find food, you need to have good vision. You don't need to be able to solve calculus problems or play chess to survive if you're a primitive animal. Acting is an interesting one, right? Again, this is something we take for granted. In fact, in the early days of AI, people thought that this was the hard thing because this was hard for people, and they thought these things would be pretty trivial and easy to do. But let's think about acting. Let's think about a skill that most of us have, which is standing up straight, just being able to stand up. Right now, we stand on two legs. Okay, that's not a stable sort of thing. It's very difficult to make a machine that can stand on two legs statically. Okay. Because if you think about it, if you're standing up, right, you've only got two legs, even if they're spread apart, right? Gradually what happens is, as your body moves forward, right, you normally would topple over unless you did something to compensate. What you do is you feel more pressure on the balls of your feet, right? So you compress muscles in your calf to flex your ankle this way to open it up and move yourself backwards. As you move backwards, you feel pressure on the heels of your feet, right? So you're falling backwards. So you do something else to compensate to go forward. So just standing up straight, okay, you can't do it if you're asleep. It requires active participation. Now think about something complex like walking, which most of us can do when we're sober at least, right? So you start out, first you're standing on two legs, right? And now you pick one up. I can't even do this without holding in slow motion because I'm going to fall over. But when you pick up your right foot to walk, what happens immediately is you start falling to the right, okay, and forward as well if you're going forward, right? The only reason you don't actually fall over is you actually put your foot down to support you. And then what you do is you pick up your other foot and you start falling to your left, right? And if you think this is trivial, watch a newborn baby or like a one-year-old try to learn this skill. It is not trivial. It's a very complex skill. And that's just walking, right? Now you think of what goes on in the World Series, right? You're at the plate, okay, and now there's a pitcher throwing a baseball at you about 100 miles an hour, and you see it end on, you've got to decide, is it a ball, is it a strike? Am I going to hit it? Am I going to hit the right field? Am I going to hit the left field? Humans are capable of incredibly complex psychomotor skills, right? Watch any professional athlete, watch a ballet dancer, watch a musician, right? Incredibly complex things that we don't have, even the beginnings of getting machines to do, but we're working on it. Okay, we're running out of time. Any questions or comments before we end? Okay, thank you all for your attention. I appreciate it.